topic is indeed effectively the topic of the conference as a whole. So this introductory presentation is an attempt to frame some issues, to suggest some paths, to indicate some possible options for discussion that I hope may be of use in informing what will come in the rest of the meeting. On the fact that adapting to climate change is a necessity, there will, I'm sure, be a consensus among this audience. The opening ceremony showed as much. Nonetheless, there is scope for misunderstanding about what the need for adaptation actually means. There may even be some potential for confusion. In order to outline how scientific, ethical, and policy considerations can come together productively in this meeting and beyond, I would like, therefore, to start my introductory remarks with two comments on what may lurk behind the apparently straightforward word adaptation. First, as everyone is aware, as a number of speakers alluded to in the opening ceremony, there is a political subtext. Adaptation is often regarded as effectively the price to pay for the failure to take mitigation seriously. And indeed, for many years it was regarded as rather incorrect to even talk about adaptation, since that implied a distraction or a lack of emphasis on mitigation. However, as I will explain a little later in this presentation, this is probably rather misleading. The Deputy Prime Minister, in his opening remarks, emphasized the need for a balanced approach to mitigation and adaptation. Not only do I share the view, but I'd be tempted to go somewhat further and to emphasize, as I will in a moment, that there is far less difference between mitigation and adaptation than is often thought. The contrast is overstated. Serious long-term mitigation will inevitably require structural social transformations, and this will be adaptation, not just to the impacts of climate change, but to the challenges of mitigating the social drivers of climate change. Secondly, second possible source of confusion, adaptation tends to be seen in purely passive terms as a coping strategy, and therefore as a cost to be borne or preferably to be avoided. However, if one takes seriously the points just made about the connections between mitigation and adaptation, one would have to qualify this view. I will discuss in a little more detail later the ways in which adaptation can also be seen as a positive process of grasping opportunities. Adaptation, thus, is neither purely passive nor purely negative. It is intimately connected to environmental concerns and development goals unrelated to climate change. Adaptation is, to that extent, what used to be called in the 1990s a no-regrets policy. The perspective on no regrets being precisely one that the Kyoto Protocol chose not to adopt, which is not, of course, to say that it doesn't raise difficulties or problems. For climate change is not a one-off problem to be solved, however ambitious international agreements may in due course turn out to be. It is rather a condition to be lived with, one that will endure as long as there is detailed predictive knowledge of what might happen to the Earth's climate, including but not limited to the effects on it of human activity. Now, the suggestion that climate change is not a problem to be solved might sound a bit perverse. It should certainly not be taken to mean that nothing can be done to reduce the ecological footprint of human activities, to ensure the transition to more sustainable energy use, or to avoid the most dangerous potential threats of sea level rise and temperature change. No, not at all. The point is that climate change is not best regarded as something purely external that happens to the Earth, though at one level it clearly is, but rather as an aspect of human knowledge and human limited capabilities. The best way to perceive this, I think, is through a thought experiment. If the Earth, for whatever reason, was subjected to catastrophic climate change, say global cooling, as a consequence of something that had nothing to do with human activity, would we therefore conclude that we have no reason and no duty to act in respect of that hypothetical global cooling? There are many science fiction stories about this. Of course not. The very fact of knowing, the very existence of capacities to act, would give rise to responsibilities within the limits of what was achievable, no doubt. And in particular, there would be a duty to show solidarity in the face of the shared challenges of adaptation, and, through prudent use of such technologies as might then be available, mitigation. Climate change is, to that extent, an essentially knowledge-shaped and knowledge-driven phenomenon. What follows is that, regardless of how well we deal with the current challenges of climate change, responsibility for the Earth's climate, in proportion to our knowledge and to our capacities, is ours to bear forever. The connection between science and adaptation thus goes deeper than the mere fact, which is important, but rather trivial, that one can hardly hope to adapt to something without some idea of what it is. Enhancing the climate change knowledge base is an essential component of adaptation, and it carries with it specific responsibilities. In particular, the knowledge base is not merely an abstract body of data and theories. It is a complex and multifaceted, socially constructed system that intertwines its epistemic features, its features as a knowledge system, with hardware, human efforts, and established institutional practices. The hardware, I doubt, will be forgotten in this meeting, but it's important to remember just how extensive is the sometimes expensive, sometimes routine hardware that we require to build, to maintain, and to enhance the scientific knowledge base. Everything from tide gauges and floating buoys to satellites. Things with a price tag in 5 figures up to things with a price tag in 8 figures. In addition, the ability to make use of the data produced by observing systems depends on the capacity to run numerical simulations, which is an important institutional issue that requires extensive investment in computing facilities, as well as intensive investment in the human capacity building required to use them. As I'm sure everyone in the room knows, there are currently only about a dozen research centers in the world that have the capacity to run multiple simulations on full-scale global circulation models. Everything that we say about climate change ultimately comes from 12 or 13 research centers. If they were all wrong, then we wouldn't even notice. I'm not suggesting that they are, simply that the narrowness of the institutional base is a problem for the scientific knowledge base itself. Science and ethics combine thus to set the stage for the policy problems that will be our principal concern in this meeting. Given what we know about what might happen, and given our priority concern for the needs and interests of the most vulnerable, what exactly should be done, how, and by whom? The answers, of course, are complex and specific to particular situations. They certainly do not derive simply from general considerations about issues and values. Climate change, as policy scientists have long put it, is a wicked or a messy problem. Wicked and messy are technical terms in the policy literature, though they don't sound very technical. What they mean is that climate change is not a problem that exists independently of the process that defines it as a problem. There is a very real sense in which climate change is what we think it is. And that is not to deny its reality, but to emphasize the difficulties in dealing with it, because they imply, among other things, that we have to choose a framing and agree on an approach. This is certainly not an argument for inaction or a counsel of pessimism. It's simply a specific challenge. It is certainly, however, a caution against simple one-off, purely technical solutions. The case of sea level rise, which is a great concern in the Caribbean, may perhaps serve as an illustration here. As you know, the main issues relating to sea level rise, as studied by the IPCC, by UNDP, by UNEP, by the World Bank, there have been a number of detailed studies on this issue in the past 3 or 4 years, concern the vulnerability of infrastructure, including but not limited to tourist infrastructure, both to the rise of the sea itself, to induced coastal erosion, particularly of beaches which are an extremely fragile environment, and to related bad weather events. There may also be indirect effects on agricultural productivity via saltwater aquifer intrusion in certain settings, though it appears that the impacts on agriculture are likely to be greater from changing temperature and precipitation. The scale of the consequences could be enormous. According to the UNDP study I was referring to, some scenarios show a cumulative impact by 2050 that could reach 30 to 40% of GDP in some Caribbean states. The question then is what to do. And the scale of the issues put a very high premium on not getting the answer wrong, particularly because any particular choice crowds out other choices. The opportunity cost of policy failure is much, much higher even than its direct monetary cost. Experience is limited and many points remain controversial. But there is a broad emerging consensus that the easy options may not be a good idea. The easy options are those based on changing hard infrastructure or protecting it with more of the same, steel and concrete. Again, hard is a semi-technical term in this context, but one that is pretty easy to understand. In the 16th Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC in Cancun last December, there were a myriad of side events devoted to various aspects of adaptation. And it was very striking how often engineers who were not occupationally hostile to steel and concrete were arguing that soft infrastructure is at least important as hard infrastructure and may require different solutions. Soft infrastructure being, for these purposes, social, human, and cultural processes that make hard infrastructure work by maintaining it, by operating it, by embedding it in concrete social processes. For example, in those areas where freshwater scarcity is likely to be aggravated by climate change, adjusting the social patterns of water use, using technologies geared to more efficient water management, is likely to be a cheaper and more effective adaptation strategy than higher dams, deeper boreholes, or highly energy-intensive seawater desalination. Similarly, with respect to tourist infrastructure, which will be discussed tomorrow in this meeting, maybe the best option is neither to protect it at all costs, nor to rebuild it like for like, but rather to rethink it, with a view to inventing a model or a diversified set of models that depend less on specific localized assets, such as beaches and hotels, and more on a soft and more flexible infrastructure of service provision. And this, as you know, is precisely what has become known in the technical and increasingly in the policy literature as resilience, a word that comes from psychology, but has a fairly straightforward meaning in this context as applied to societies in the face of climate change. Not, therefore, adapting to one particular change once, but enhancing the capacity of society as a whole to understand and to respond positively to change in general. Hence the emphasis put by Mrs. Alvarez on social innovation in her introductory remarks this morning. Two additional ideas deserve to be mentioned in this context. First, climate change cannot be understood as a policy challenge unless the full range of its social, human, and cultural dimensions are taken into account. Otherwise, policy gets locked into a hard infrastructure perspective and a self-defeating search for one-off technical solutions. The sectorialization of climate change, the tendency to divide it up into little packages, each of which is the responsibility of a sectoral ministry, is often part of the problem in this regard. You cannot address, for instance, the impact of climate change on agriculture without reference to transport. You cannot address climate change in cities without reference to housing policy and energy policy. And governance structures are typically not designed to ensure this kind of comprehensive approach. They tend rather to encourage fragmentation. Secondly, climate change is an opportunity as well as a challenge, even in particularly vulnerable societies. I gave the example of irrational water use, which should be addressed anyway for reasons unrelated to climate change. Another example, which is, I think, well known, particularly from the recent work of UNEP, is the problem of black carbon, soot. Soot is a byproduct of poor combustion, and it also contributes directly to climate change via atmospheric particulate concentration and even more glacial deposit. By making glaciers darker, soot makes them absorb more heat and therefore melt faster. But even before we talk about climate change, soot in many developing countries is a very serious health hazard that causes hundreds of thousands of deaths annually, primarily among women and children, because they are in direct contact with the poorly designed and poorly maintained open fireplaces on which they cook. In conclusion, to borrow this morning's joke. But it's true. It is actually the conclusion. This meeting invites us to look back to COP16 in Cancun and to take stock of the very modest and perhaps transient successes achieved there. However, it is perhaps even more important to look forward, not just to COP17 in Durban at the end of this year, but also to the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio de Janeiro in May 2012, 20 years after the conference at which the UNFCCC, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Rio Declaration, and Agenda 21 were adopted. It is not very controversial, I think, to suggest that the deliberate adoption by the international community of a very narrow framing of climate change, which is the logic of the Kyoto Protocol, has not made the issue easier to handle, as was assumed in 1997, but has actually created a fairly severe form of gridlock. Movement towards a more comprehensive agenda, which was actually clearly in evidence even within the UNFCCC process itself in 2010, brings its own dangers, of course, the danger of dilution. The broader the agenda, the less the need to focus on any particular part of it, of distraction. Minor issues might attract all the attention and prevent an adequate response to major issues. And of course, the risk of a purely a la carte approach to action against climate change. Nonetheless, if the arguments I've been sketching in this introductory presentation are even in part correct, broadening the climate change agenda could help address it in the way it demands. If so, adapting to climate change would become just one very important dimension of sustainable development, not a one-off problem to be solved, but an ongoing, never-finished challenge. Not simply a cost to be borne, but a stepping stone towards a more human world. Thank you.
I would like to ask to Dr. Crowley, because for us, the small island states and the developing countries, of course, adaptations is a main issue.
Yes, certainly. Mitigation is less significant for UNESCO because of the range of UNESCO's competences. The international community, as you know, has desired to make discussions on binding legal agreements with respect to mitigation the exclusive province of the UNFCCC negotiating process. UNESCO has no role in that. So this isn't an issue for UNESCO's activities. However, I fully agree with you that in the absence of serious efforts to ensure mitigation, many of the positive things I said about adaptation would become largely irrelevant. And indeed, the situation is worse even than you indicated, because 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise over pre-industrial levels, or even over some more recent benchmark, is a convenient reference point for supposedly non-dangerous climate change. It is not what's